Well, good evening and welcome to Tucker Carlson Tonight. One refugee resettlement group has loudly protested President Trump's restriction on refugee arrivals. Tonight, the head of that group will join us right here. Also, a former CIA officer says his agency's shadow war against the president is imperiling democracy itself, and he'll join us too. But first, we're a whole month into the Trump administration, and the administration is still rolling out its immigration agenda. Today, White House Press Secretary Sean Spicer suggested that the White House may start rolling back legal immigration as well. Here's part of what he said.
I wanted to see if this White House and President Trump have any interest in curtailing legal immigration going forward.
Again, we got to look at this from a priority level. Right now, there's millions of people in this country that are in the country illegally. I think the focus continues to be that 800,000 or 900,000 that have already had an order to have them removed and get them processed through in a way that continues to keep America safe. Legal immigration, obviously, is a completely separate subject, and that includes visa reform and all that other stuff. The president's talked about that. He's talked about it with business leaders, H-1B visas, et cetera. You're going to see more of that coming.
Well, Ann Coulter is a best-selling author and one of the very few people to predict a Trump presidency way back in June of 2015, and she did it on tape. Question is she happy with what's happened a month in, especially in immigration? She joins us now. Ann, thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
So you wrote a book that I think influenced the president a lot on immigration, and you've been a pretty strong advocate for changing our immigration laws. How are you feeling? Are you satisfied with what the Trump administration has done so far?
So far, I give him an A+. He got an A just for replacing Obama.
Okay, and the plus comes from what?
Noon on January 20th. Well, he's up against, I mean, he can get to the DACA stuff. He can get to, that's the Dreamers,
right.
Who are, by the way, committing murder and child rape. We've never had a president who's being opposed on all fronts like this, including from, as my column today is about, Republicans in Congress, including the entire federal bureaucracy, including the entire federal judiciary, including the fake news. And he's right about the fake news. So, I mean, considering all of he has to do, he's Gary Cooper out there in high noon. He is standing there alone, and he has done so much in the first month considering that.
Is he making his case effectively, do you think? Is he bringing the public along with him? Is he explaining why he wants to do this well?
I think so, and, there are enough of us to perform backup details, but look at the way he's gone after the media, for example. No other Republican would have done that, and it's an incredibly important thing to do. They keep lying about how he's had a tweet against the media. No, he had a tweet against fake news. And if you disagree with the idea that fake news is bad for a democracy, well, then you can sign up with Goebbels and Leni Riefenstahl, because that is what he's saying. And we are getting fake news. We're getting it constantly. I now heard the third time, and I haven't even been watching very much TV, third time tonight, that, in fact, many studies show immigrants commit less crime than natives. No, it doesn't. No, it doesn't. No, it doesn't. That's an absolute lie. What these phony studies do, and they're all hidden behind paywalls on the Internet. So I actually had to pay at some point to read it to get and find out what they're doing.
That's one of the most commonly repeated talking points.
It's absolutely a lie, which I describe a lot in Chapter 7 of Adios America, but the studies that allegedly show this do not compare immigrants to Americans. They compare immigrants to Americans who have been convicted of a serious offense. No, we wanted to get immigrants who are better than ex-cons here in America. It's not comparing it to all Americans.
So none of the studies are a flat comparison between recent arrivals and native-born Americans.
That's right, and thank heaven. I mean, one of the great things, one of the reasons Trump is getting an A+ is putting Sessions at Department of Justice, because could we get some numbers on this? As I describe in Adios America, the government hides this information. They won't tell us how many immigrants are in prison, and I don't mean just illegal immigrants. Legal immigrants, I mean, isn't that worse? The government checked you guys out and let you in. The government won't tell us that information, and I hope under Trump we will start to get some genuine information. It's just like the claims on voter fraud, for example. I'm so glad Trump brought that up.
Wait, so just to back up 1 sec. So just the bottom line on the crime question is, in absolute terms, immigrants, legal and illegal, are more likely to commit a crime than native-born Americans.
All the evidence suggests that. I mean, I go through that in Chapter 7, and since the government won't tell us, I notice that only my side is asking for the facts. Their side is not asking for the facts. Why can't the government just count? How many immigrants are in prison? I mean, they've had significant contact with the government. Right. They've been arrested. They've been prosecuted. They're sitting in prisons that we are paying for. Could you count? No, the census can't tell us that.
Why do you think they don't? I mean, they count everything else.
Because I think they know what the answer would be, which is why I think it's worth pointing out. I'm the one who wants the answer. Our side wants the absolute numbers. So what I did in Adios America is I looked at other things. One place where you can get some of this information is looking at prisons, because prisons need to know the nationality of their prisoners because of gang warfare. So they have very detailed records on inmates in New York State, for example, and, you know, there are thousands of Dominicans, one German.
So if let's say you were in charge of the federal government, how would you prioritize it? What would you do immediately and then secondarily on immigration?
Well, I think he's doing this right. I mean, yes, I do want him to get to the dreamers and to get to the legal immigration. I mean, everybody, there is this weird kink even conservatives have in their brains: legal immigration good, illegal immigration bad. Well, no, the Boston Marathon bombers were legal.
Right.
All of these refugees, the ones who shot up San Bernardino, the one child of an immigrant in Orlando, these are all legal immigrants. Since 1970, we've been admitting more than 1 million immigrants a year, 90% from the third world. The vast majority not only vote Democrat, which is their main purpose for being here, but consume vast amounts of welfare. Why don't we just have an immigration policy that brings in people that help us, that makes our country a better place? That, it seems to me, was the theme of the Trump campaign. We're going to look at this from the perspective of Americans. So what would that look like?
How would you filter it? So, I mean, clearly there are a lot of immigrants who are a massive net positive for America, and the statistics are pretty widely known.
Not too many anymore.
Et cetera. But you can point to quite a few.
Most of them are pre-1970.
So how would you discern between people who want to come here who are likely to help the country and people who are likely to hurt the country?
See if the New York Times wants to write up a glowing profile on them every time we do something. I mean, that's what they did on the travel ban that Trump did. I noticed they pulled out certain refugees. Usually it wasn't the refugees themselves, it was a parent who wanted to come here from these countries. And wow, 2 cancer researchers? So apparently the New York Times is aware that that's a desirable characteristic in an immigrant, being a cancer researcher, for example. So how about we only get the cancer researchers and the smart ones, and the ones who are going to compete for your job and my job and their jobs, and not their landscapers' jobs?
Is there a country that does this well?
Canada used to do it well. I don't think it will under Trudeau. Switzerland, you have to be there for 3 generations, I believe, to become a citizen. Australia and New Zealand. And what's interesting about that, they have a $14 minimum wage in Australia. Why is that? It's a natural minimum wage. Nobody had to pass a law. You didn't need Bernie Sanders out there. It rose naturally because they didn't dump low-wage workers on their country.
Are you disappointed in anything the president has done?
No. I mean, the thing
there's not one thing that he's done where you thought,
I think he should tweet more.
Come on now. What would be the purpose of that?
I love his tweets. I love them so much. It drives the media crazy. Everything. And I wrote in Trump We Trust, E Pluribus Awesome. I wrote it with Never Trumpers in mind. I understand what the complaints are with Donald Trump. But then as I was writing it, I realized, no, all the stuff that I used to say, okay, well, there is this baggage, but he's the only one who's pushing, and the only one in my lifetime to push issues that are important for America. I started to realize, no, I actually like even the stuff, even the baggage.
What about his staff? Are you impressed by? They're the most impressive people. Do you think Spicer's doing a good job explaining the White House point of view?
Well, no one can do it as well as Trump.
But do you think he's doing relative to other press secretaries? Kind of boring.
Other than that, I have no complaints.
What do you think of Reince Priebus, White House Chief of Staff?
I don't really know the details. He seems fine. My favorite human being is Stephen Miller, and I do think Trump should take him as his vice president for the 2nd term.
Is that an expression of your lack of confidence in Vice President Pence?
Oh, yeah, no, we can't have Reagan, Bush again. No. It's got to be somebody new. I mean, it could be Kobach. It doesn't have to be Miller.
And Coulter, thank you.
Thank you.
Trump administration responding to a series of protests at Republican town halls by saying the participants are simply professional protesters. For more on that, we go to Fox's Trace Gallagher, who's been following it. Hey, Trace.
Hey, Tucker, Louisiana GOP Senator Bill Cassidy just wrapped up a very contentious town hall. In fact, Cassidy was forced to abandon his PowerPoint presentation on the Republicans' plan to replace Obamacare when the angry crowd shouted him down and literally turned their backs on him. Instead of listening to his presentation on health care, the crowd demanded Cassidy answer their questions. Watch.
I will answer a lot of these questions if you'll just let me speak. And so,
it's tier one.
Of course, this type of scene has been playing out across the country, leaving many Republicans to question the origins and motivations of the crowds. After Utah Congressman Jason Chaffetz's town hall was stormed by protesters, Chaffetz told the Deseret News that he believes those who attended were, quote, paid out-of-state rabble-rousers. When pressed for evidence to support his claim, a Chaffetz spokeswoman pointed to a police statement saying some of the protesters did not live in Utah. But police later said most of those on hand were locals. Even Chaffetz amended his statement saying, quote, the overwhelming majority of people there were Utahns. They weren't paid. Were there some paid components to it? Yeah, I'm convinced there were. But so far, we have found no confirmation that protesters are being paid, although some of them are being organized and partially trained by groups like MoveOn.org and the Center for American Progress. Today, President Trump tweeted, quote, the so-called angry crowds in home districts of some Republicans are actually, in numerous cases, planned out by liberal activists. Sad. Back in 2009, then White House Press Secretary Robert Gibbs said the angry protests against Obamacare were also, quote, manufactured anger. Tucker.
Trace Gallagher. Thanks a lot, Trace. Time now for Twitter Storm, our nightly forecast of social media's most powerful weather patterns. The big joke on Twitter the last couple of days was the Washington Post, always something of a joke, but it recently unveiled a new logo, Democracy Dies in Darkness. People had some fun at the paper's expense. Colin Jones tweeted this, loving the new goth vibe at the Washington Post. David Hines said, next move for Washington Post, multiple piercings, eyeliner, unironically shopping at Hot Topic. Paul tweeted this, sounds like a very dull Harry Potter title. Of course, he has a point. Harry Potter and the Dark Dead Democracy. Would you read that? I wouldn't. Mark Rabo was quite blunt. He said, bring a torch. And Danny Brackett tweeted this, journalism dies in fakeness, as it has. That's tonight's Twitter Storm. Up next, colleges used to be known for free speech. That was the whole point of them, actually. But now hundreds of colleges encourage students to report anything that offends them. We'll talk to a campus civil liberties advocate who is trying to sound the alarm on that. Also, President Trump's crackdown on refugee arrivals didn't just affect refugees. It affected organizations that takes taxpayer money to resettle those refugees. We'll talk to the head of one such organization coming up. This is a Fox News alert. President Trump tore down another remnant of the Obama legacy today, with the administration announcing the end of Obama's transgender bathroom rule. That rule, which was imposed last May, of course, barred public schools from restricting bathrooms, locker rooms, and changing rooms by biological sex. Instead, schools had to let students use whatever facilities they wanted to use in accordance with their professed gender identity. The White House press secretary says that rule was legally dubious and infringed on states' rights. It also, by the way, redefined biology in a manner wholly inconsistent with science. Ask any scientist. Well, it is a dark age, an age of darkness in the American academy. According to research by the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, called FIRE, hundreds of colleges around this country have policies encouraging students to report any offensive speech or other crime think they overhear from their classmates. Once such thought crime is reported, squads with Orwellian names like Bias Incident Response Team swoop in and impose all manner of penalties. These range from sensitivity training to suspension. How do we get here exactly? Robert Shibley is the executive director of FIRE, and he joins us now. Robert, thanks a lot for coming on.
Thanks very much for having me.
It's hard to believe this is real. Bias response teams?
Not only is it real, it's really horrifyingly widespread. We found more than 230 of these teams in our searches across campuses nationwide, and we're sure there's more that we haven't identified. The ones we found, though, cover and they monitor the speech of 2.84 million students.
So the idea is that the school is sending out students to tattle on other students for saying things they believe is, what, offensive, indecent, inappropriate? Like, what's the standard?
In some cases, and the standard varies, but they are actually trying to seek out bias and destroy it on campuses. And so through a series of online forms that you often fill out, or just encouraging students. I mean, we see, if you see something, say something on some of these bias response team websites, they're encouraging people to come forward, and they say, if you hear something that's biased, and that can be defined as something as sort of
Well,
vague.
that's it. What's the definition?
Well, it can be super vague, and
but it's always vague, right? I mean, if you're going to have a rule, a standard, you ought to have to define it, especially if there's a penalty attached to it, right? So do kids know what's in bounds and what's outside of bounds?
I don't think they do, and it varies from place to place. Some it depends on the protected classes that are covered by the bias response teams, and some of them are crazy. Like in Kentucky, one of the protected classes at the University of Kentucky is smoker status. There's universities that protect size. There's a university, I think Oregon, protects shape.
So you're not allowed to complain about smoking in Kentucky?
Right. Well, you're not allowed to try to either relate to somebody or avoid relating to them based on a stereotype that you might have in your mind about smokers if it's negative. So not only can you not, you can't even avoid folks based on these things, or it can be reported as a bias report.
Ah, it's probably the only place in the world standing up for smokers. That's kind of interesting. But is there a list somewhere? Is there like a Bible of bias? Like, where do you go to find out what the rules are?
Well, Fire has put out this bias response teams report, and so if you're at one of the schools there, you can look, and we've tabulated that on our website, thefire.org. But frankly, for most students, they're going to have to search around for bias response team or something like that on their website and find out what they can be reported for. And I think one of the really little known or little appreciated facts about this is that effectively these are all going into a big database, generally controlled by the government. 42% of these bias response teams include police departments. And so, for instance, at Dartmouth, if you go to their bias response form and you can anonymously put something in, that goes straight to the judicial affairs folks and the police.
This is like the Cultural Revolution, really, the search for kulaks. These are crypto government institutions. All colleges are, almost all. They take massive amounts of federal dollars. And yet they're encouraging the violation of constitutional rights, the most basic one, the freedom of speech. Where's the Justice Department in this? Where's the Civil Rights Division? Shouldn't they be swooping in and protecting kids from having their rights taken away?
Well, one of the oddities of federal law is that it actually doesn't cover First Amendment violations, while laws like Title VI and Title IX, which have to do with racial and sexual discrimination, those are enforced through the potential loss of federal funding. The First Amendment and free speech is not among those laws.
Huh. So what would it take to make it among those laws?
It would most likely take congressional action to do that.
So it would be pretty simple, right? It would just say the First Amendment applies to everyone in the country, as if we needed a reminder of that. But
I think the complicated part would be determining when they've gone too far for the First Amendment. Obviously, Fire does that on our website, but you wouldn't want to just take Fire's word for it. There'd have to be some mechanism for determining, you know what, this time, you're not following the First Amendment.
But I guess my last question is, apart from Fire, who's there to help kids whose freedom of speech is being abridged by the schools they go to?
I think it's fair to say that we're the primary folks out there doing that.
How many staff members do you have?
Fire's about 50 folks now, so we've grown a lot.
Does the
ACLU,
which is supposed to be protecting our civil rights, ever jump in and say, you've got a right to say what you think?
We've had a good relationship with a number of state ACLU chapters over the years, and so we're always happy. I mean, we'll work with anyone. Fire is a nonpartisan organization, and we'd love to work with anyone who cares about free speech on campus.
It shouldn't be left to 50 people to defend the First Amendment. That's really sad. So I hope you grow.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We'll put a link on to their report on our Facebook page, Tucker Carlson Tonight. Up next, the furor over President Trump's travel ban has overshadowed another big shift in policy, his substantial reduction in the refugee cap. We'll talk to a head of a refugee resettlement group that has complained about that cut. That's next. Well, the White House pushed back its planned revision of President Trump's executive order blocking arrivals temporarily from 7 Muslim-majority countries. White House Press Secretary Sean Spicer said this about that today. Watch.
These were countries that we didn't have the proper vetting for when it came to ensuring the safety of Americans. That's what the executive order said. The authority is very clear to having done it, and I think that you're going to continue to see the president take the steps necessary to protect this country. That's why he's talked about fighting this on both fronts, making sure that we keep evolving through the court system on the existing EO, and then looking towards the next draft of the executive order.
Scott Arbeiter is the president of World Relief. It's a Christian organization. He's also a pastor, and the organization provides refugee resettlement services, among other things. The organization just had to close 5 offices and lay off 140 people, a development it blames directly on the executive order out of the White House, which drastically curtailed the number of refugees who might arrive here in the U.S. Scott Arbeiter joins us right here in the studio. Scott, thanks a lot for coming on.
Thanks for having me, Tucker.
So there are, according to the UN, more than 60 million people displaced in the world right now. How many is the U.S. morally obligated to bring here?
I couldn't tell you what the moral obligation for the U.S. is. I think our history has been that we've been a compassionate people, and I think that every administration, along with every legislature, has to decide what is that obligation at any particular point in time. I don't think I could put a number on what the moral obligation is, but I think it should be more than zero, and I think it should be in some way connected to what is the tragedy that the world is facing right now. America being, I think, arguably the greatest country in the world with the greatest security, the greatest resources, and the greatest freedoms, is situated right in the middle of a world that is in the worst refugee crisis ever. So the president has said, and I applaud him for this, he wants to make America great. And I think the question for us is, what does great look like when you have those resources and those freedoms and you have that tragedy? Can we be so great as to hold both security and compassion together?
Okay, I think that's all fair. I mean, I would argue that our country is a lot less affluent than people think it is, and actually we're not the richest country, we don't have the most resources. But leaving that aside, you can see why people would get uncomfortable, and I think your motives are good. But when you say things like, well, we're a good country, we have an obligation, it's more than zero, I mean, math plays a role in this. So what do you personally think would be a good number? 500,000 a year, 3 million a year. I mean, these are physical people. You do this for a living. Like, what do you think's a good number?
Yeah, I'll give you a personal opinion on that, Tucker.
Yeah.
I would say that if we were looking at about 1%, because you got about 21 million refugees, and let's remember, these are traumatized people running from the very enemies we're rightly trying to defeat. They've been bombed out of their homes. They're cold. They're hungry. They're unwanted any place. And you say, okay, do we have any compassion for these people? And if we do, then let's create a place where we can safely bring them in. We can hold safety and security together. I would say out of the 21 million, if we could bring in 1%, and right now we're aiming at 0.2%, I think we can be great in both compassion and for how long?
Over what period? Is that an obligation that just exists forever?
No, I think because we've watched, the nation has responded to different periods of time in different ways, and we don't have the moral authority to dictate what that is, but we are calling for a greater level of compassion when you take a look at just how tragic these circumstances are and the quality of the work we can do if we're great in both our vetting and in our compassion.
Here's what I don't understand. And again, I think your compassion is real, and I applaud it. And I think it is a Christian's duty to be compassionate. I don't think it's the U.S. government's duty to be compassionate. It's its duty to protect its citizens and, to the extent possible, ensure their prosperity.
Well, I think the government has decided to do both for many years.
But why are you taking any government money? You take tens of millions of dollars from the government, and as a Christian organization, doing what you see as your Christian duty, why should taxpayers subsidize that?
Well, it's a good question, and it's interesting because the people that have been critics of ours for taking any money now to help in refugee resettlement, and by the way, that's not new. We've been doing it for 7 presidential administrations since Reagan. So it's been an American value for 40 years through multiple administrations, not new for us or for the American people to do that. But when we have helped the government resettle suffering people because they said, you know, the public-private partnership works, it's better when communities and churches are a part of this, I think people have expected that we would be either defensive or embarrassed about taking government money. We're actually proud that we do this work so well using so many volunteers, thousands of churches, tens of thousands of people to help the government accomplish what it decided to do. Wait
a second, but you say on your, and I get that, but you say on your website you're doing this because it's biblical, you're doing it out of your Christian faith, which for the third time I respect. But how is it consistent with your Christian faith to give away something that doesn't belong to you, which is to say the country or tax dollars? If you're doing this out of Christian faith, why not pay for it?
Well, here we are, but here's what.
But you're not. I mean, you took $42 million in government money last year.
That's not right. I mean, it's close, but
that's what your tax form says.
It is both. The U.S. government makes a decision about resettling refugees. Let's be clear. No refugee gets to pick to come to the United States. They only come if invited by the State Department. World Relief doesn't invite them. We don't pick them. We don't vet them. We don't even know who they are until the State Department hands us the file and says, we have chosen to resettle these refugees. Right. It's a government decision. And when the government decides to do that, they're coming at us and saying, would you help us then integrate these
But you're not answering my question exactly. So you're doing this as a Christian because you think it's your Christian duty, which I think is great. then why wouldn't your duty be to actually go all the way and pay for it? Why is it noble as a Christian to force other people to pay for your Christian duty? That's what I don't understand.
Yeah, we're doing both, Tucker, and here's why. The U.S. government, because they decided to resettle refugees, said it's only helpful to resettle refugees if they can integrate into a community. So the government gives about $1,100 per person for a 90-day period, and they also then help us build the volunteer pools by which we serve over the years.
Okay.
We do that. But let me finish. Many churches and many individuals and foundations also pay for that work. The government isn't paying for all that work. We've got a vast
$42 million, not including the cost to educate these people and their children and to pay for their health care, which the U.S. government does, you do not do, to pay for the infrastructure they use. I mean, it's a massive cost to the taxpayer. And I would just take Christians more seriously if they said, I have a Christian duty to do this. I'm going to go to Syria and help people there, or maybe bring them here and educate them myself, have them live in my home, and pay the whole freight.
We can't. First of all, we do go to Syria. We're in 5 Middle East countries. We think we ought to care over there and care over here as well. We can't resettle a refugee and pay for it because the government can only the U.S. State Department decides if a refugee comes.
Oh, but you could. So the refugee could come here and you could say, this is a Christian home into which you will now go, you will live there, and they're going to carry the costs of keeping you here as you get on your feet. And instead you offload those costs onto the U.S. taxpayer and call yourself virtuous. That's the problem I have.
What you're missing, Tucker, is it's a public-private partnership that many of our critics lauded us for when we were accepting money from the George W. Bush administration to help combat HIV/AIDS around the world through the churches. Public-private partnership. The government brings a part of it, and we bring an amazing group of people in a volunteer network.
I'm not saying you don't do a good job. I'm just saying, how do you call it Christian if you're not paying for it?
And we continue to do that work, and we pay for it long after the government is no longer involved in their lives. We're there.
Do you pay for the education of the refugees who come?
No.
Do you pay for their health care?
No, but again, that is a government decision. I pay taxes too.
I know you do, but people who don't agree with the policy are forced to pay for it, and you take the moral credit for it. That's the problem.
We are not taking any moral credit for this. We wouldn't be in here having this conversation. We quietly go about this work because we're trying to take seriously Jesus' command, do to others what you would want to have done to you.
But there was no part about get $42 million from the government in Jesus' command.
Well, I will tell you that if you're concerned about the amount of money and what it does, our average staff person in the U.S. who does this work, amazing people, I'm so proud of, their average salary is about $10,000 a year, less than an assistant manager.
I don't think you're doing it to get rich. I'm not saying that for a second. I'm sure every person who works for you is doing it. I don't think that. It's obviously not true. I think you're doing it because you think it's your duty. But again, my point, I've restated it, you clearly disagree, is that when you have a duty to do something because you think God wants you to do it, you should accept the entire responsibility and not offload it onto the unwilling, i.e. taxpayers.
Yeah. I think the government has a right to make a decision about who they're going to bring in. We don't have that right. And as long as they've decided to do that, and they said we want to participate in that by doing it well, we need partners, that public-private partnership is something we're actually proud of, not embarrassed by.
Scott, thanks a lot for explaining that. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Tucker.
Up next, reports swirling of a CIA shadow war against the new administration. We'll talk to a former CIA officer, a Democrat, who says his ex-colleagues are letting petty hostility endanger democracy itself. Plus, if you thought Sweden was the only Scandinavian nation having trouble with integrating people from the Middle East, that is not the case. At neighboring Denmark, it appears the government has accidentally become a sponsor of ISIS. They've admitted it, actually. We've got details coming up. Well, Sweden is not the only Scandinavian utopia that seems to be losing its sheen thanks to mass immigration from the Middle East. The government of Denmark may have inadvertently become a state sponsor of terror. The government admitted to the New York Times it paid hundreds of thousands of kroners to individuals who have run off to join the Islamic State in Syria. Ironically, the ISIS recruits in question were receiving disability pensions, this is all true, by the way, provided to those unable to work. Apparently, the providence of Allah healed their ailing bodies long enough for them to pursue the hard labor of jihad in an inhospitable land. Amazingly, the Danish government kept the payments flowing even after their membership in ISIS was discovered, because in Denmark, the law makes it almost impossible to cut off welfare even for suspected terrorists. Since it's been revealed, the government in Denmark is saying it's trying its best to change that law. Well, reports and rumors have swirled in the past month about a very hostile relationship between the new president and the intelligence community. According to the Wall Street Journal, intel agents are hiding some information from the president. Some have also blamed the CIA for the downfall of National Security Advisor Michael Flynn. Brian Dean Wright is a former CIA operative. He's also a Democrat. But he is disgusted with the shadow war he says his former colleagues appear to be conducting against the president. Quote, for reasons of misguided righteousness or partisan hatred, he wrote in a piece last week, they've taken it upon themselves to be judge, jury, and executioner. Brian Dean Wright joins us in the studio. Brian, thanks a lot for coming on.
Thank you.
So there are these reports that are troubling that various agencies are withholding intel from the White House. Do you think those are true?
I do. And here's the issue. I do think so. And I think there are probably a couple of things happening here. One, we saw this in the fall with the dossier. I think some things are being leaked to discredit the president.
Yes.
And then the second piece is I think some folks are holding information back. And that's deeply troubling. I think it should be for all of us.
It's illegal, too, isn't it?
Well, of course, yeah. I mean, we start to get into grounds of treason. Look, I'm a Democrat, and I certainly didn't support or vote for President Trump. But before I'm a Democrat, I'm an American.
Yes.
And I think the vast majority of spies understand that and are committed to that. But there are a fair number of these folks who are engaging in a very, very dangerous game. And I think and I support the president in his efforts to find these folks and throw them in jail.
Yeah, I mean, because we're supposed to have civilian control of the intelligence agencies and the military. Do you think that's in jeopardy?
I think we start to head down a very dangerous road that places like Pakistan and Egypt have gone down, where military and intelligence officers who are in the shadows, right? They are elected by no one. They get to decide, put their finger on the scale of who wins and loses in the political world. I think when we start seeing this garbage, I think we are in deep, deep trouble. In fact, there was a tweet by a journalist who said effectively that the intelligence community has declared war on President Trump and that they plan to see him die in jail. That is scary. I don't care if you're Republican or Democrat or independent or green. It doesn't matter. Intelligence officers should never be in the business of doing this kind of hinky stuff. It's ridiculous.
And it's been a concern for 70 years since the OSS and CIA started.
That's right.
The idea that the president would get either information that was tailored to force a certain conclusion or that he wouldn't get the entire picture from his intel agencies. Are there mechanisms in place within CIA to prevent that from happening?
Well, yes. The frustration that I see is, listen, the Department of Justice and Congress, they have the ability, in fact, the authorization to look into these counter-espionage concerns. And I think that those are real between President Trump, some of the folks in his entourage, and the Russian government. That should be investigated. That is being investigated.
Right.
But that ought not be what the spies get involved in. That can't be what we do. But yes, within the CIA, within the Department of Justice, and certainly Congress, the oversight committees, that's their job. That is not the job of a spy to figure out who wins and loses
Well,
politically.
of course not. And the CIA exists to give intelligence to the president so he can make the decision. So for those of us following at home, where do you think the fault lines are going to be? What are the policies Trump is espousing that a lot of people at CIA disagree with where they might try to hamstring him?
Well, I think two things, if I may. When he went to the CIA, one of his first days in office, he stood in front of the wall, and he was very almost campaign-like in how he handled that interaction. I think that was a mistake, and I think that fell on very, very hard ears within the agency, and I think a lot of people got pretty upset with him for doing that. So I think that as a president becomes a bit more presidential, if I may be so blunt, I think the intelligence community will start to respect him.
They just don't like his style.
I think that's a part of it, right? But the other piece is, when he rejected the intelligence community's assessment that the Russians were involved in trying to throw the election, that was very difficult and frustrating to hear the then president-elect or candidate Trump say that wasn't true. So if the president can get past some of those pieces and be frank and say, listen, I don't care what the Russians thought that they were going to get from me, they're not going to, because I answer only to the American people. That kind of spirit will absolutely get the spies on his side and to a greater degree. But at the end of the day, the vast majority of America's spies do their job, and they do precisely what they signed up for, what their oath calls them to do, which is be faithful to the Constitution and be faithful to the President of the United States.
Boy, you've just confirmed a lot of conspiracy theories going back an awful long time that the CIA is not fully under control of the president. It's upsetting. Very quickly, what would you say the political breakdown is within the building at Langley?
It's pretty split, but I have to say, when we walk in, we're not Republicans or Democrats.
Right.
We're not.
But you worked there a
Muslim.
long time. What do you think?
Yeah, I would say 50-50. It really is a fair split. I mean, maybe a little bit more conservative even for those of us who are Democrats.
Right.
But the bottom line is it is a very diverse place, politically speaking.
Yes.
Yeah.
Interesting. Brian, that was really troubling. Thanks.
Great. Thank you.
Up next, a black civil rights advocate says the group hurt most by illegal immigration and with the most to gain from stopping it are black men in America. He joins us next to explain. Well, the push against illegal immigration is often attacked as a racist effort by white Americans to keep out non-white immigrants. But one black civil rights advocate says, in fact, the biggest victims of low-wage illegal labor are black men in this country who see their own job opportunities dry up and their own wages undercut. Peter Kirsanow is a member of the United States Commission on Civil Rights. He was also a candidate for President Trump's Secretary of Labor, and he joins us now. Peter, thanks a lot for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
So this is a position you don't hear very much, but it makes a kind of intuitive sense. Unpack it, if you would. What do you mean when you say that black men in America are the biggest victims of this?
Sure. Well, just to give you a little bit of background, we've conducted at least 3 hearings over the last 6 years of the Civil Rights Commission on this discrete issue. And we had a number of experts testify. We deduced a lot of information with respect to the economic impact of illegal immigration on low-skilled workers generally. And all of the witnesses, all of the experts that we had who spanned the ideological spectrum, they may have disagreed in terms of the degree of the impact, but all of them concurred that illegal immigration has a devastating impact on wage levels and employment levels. And it's Econ 101, Tucker. When you have an oversupply of labor, the price of labor is going to be depressed. And also, we have an oversupply of low-skilled labor. And what happens is black males are disproportionately concentrated in the low-skilled labor market, disproportionately have only high school diplomas. And over the last about 20 years or so, the bulk of our immigration, or both legal and illegal, has been on the low-skilled side. So we have an oversupply of low-skilled labor. It has a particularly magnified effect among black males who are in that cohort. But it's not just black males, it's all low-skilled Americans. It's also having a trickle-up effect on other Americans also, and it has effect on black females also, and has profound sociological implications as well.
I don't even know what the counter-argument to what you just said is. It seems obvious. It's clearly true. Has anyone told the Congressional Black Caucus?
Yeah, I have. On at least 3 occasions and probably more. What we did is immediately after reducing some of this evidence, and it's profound because we're talking about I think it's a 40% of the 18-point decline in labor force participation rates among black males is attributable to the oversupply of illegal immigration labor competing with them. So we're talking about, at the very low end, hundreds of thousands of blacks losing jobs, probably, if you do the math, up to 1.2 million blacks losing jobs. This has significant, obviously, impacts on the black community. Got in touch with the Congressional Black Caucus, sent them detailed information on this, asked them to do something about it, to respond to us, to engage in this effort. My assistant repeatedly would follow up on this. And what we heard were crickets. Did the same thing with President Barack Obama, crickets again. And this isn't some minor matter. When we're talking about a labor force participation rate of 61.8%, an appalling labor force participation rate among black males, and again, family formation rates are affected by this, incarceration rates are affected by this. This may be one of the top issues facing the black community, but I've heard silence, but worse than silence, frankly. We've seen Congressional Black Caucus and many others embrace the open borders philosophy that's done such damage to black employment prospects.
This seems like a scandal to me. Can you explain it?
I think it really has to do with political imperatives. I really can't explain it going beyond that. I can't get into their heads. But this is something that is plain. It's unequivocal. It's not something that's complicated. And yet they've embraced an element that actually does egregious harm to the prospects of the black community. Again, I'm focused right now on the black community, but it does incredible harm with respect to all employment at the low-skilled level. And then we've seen what's happened with H-1B and H-2B visas. We can handle that smartly, but it's not being handled smartly, and it's affecting black workers. But I think that the political imperative of identity politics has trumped, no pun intended, the desire or the imperative to protect your constituents.
It's just so striking to hear someone discuss immigration in economic terms, using numbers and social science, rather than in identity politics terms. And I just wonder why more on the left don't do that. They used to.
I think again, I'm not an expert at these things, I'm just kind of surmising, but if you take a look at what they've been doing for the last several years, engaging in identity politics, I think they made a demographic calculation that if they were able to specify certain groups that they think that they can stir up so that they will vote in a particular fashion. That augurs to their short-term benefit, regardless of what happens to their constituents.
It's shocking. Peter, thank you for that. That was a great explanation.
Thanks for having me.
Well, NASA announced today a big find, more than half a dozen planets that will one day be conquered by a human space empire. That fascinating story is up next.